We're gonna get started. There we go. Okay. Few last thoughts. Okay, hi everyone. I believe this is our last seminar of the term, so thank you for coming out. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're gathering on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. When I reflect on this acknowledgement, I also really think about, particularly as a research institution and a university, how important part of that work of reconciliation and decolonization is also about how we produce knowledge, whose knowledge we center. And even though today the presentation is not specifically going to focus on Indigenous knowledges, I think it's going to pick up on some of those themes of epistemic justice. And we can think about how different communities can work in solidarity to advance that. I'm delighted to introduce Manvi Bhalla, who's a PhD candidate here at IRES, whom I have the pleasure of co-supervising with Layla Harris, who's also here today. Manvi is a scholar and an activist. She has over 15 years of community organizing experience. In recognition of that work, she's been named one of the top 25 environmentalists under 25 in Canada. A lot of the themes from her organizing work in terms of environmental justice, climate justice, working with youth, working with women and gender diverse communities, I think is also really reflected in her research here at IRES. So I'm excited to pass it over to Manvi to share just one piece of her dissertation
work. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Is this like on? Up a little bit? Okay. Maybe like this. Sorry guys, this always happens with the floppy collar. Awesome. Hi everyone. Thank you so much, Amanda, for the introduction. And I'm really excited to get into it because it's so hard to get my results section down to the timeline. I'm just gonna launch right into it for you guys and give you the most out of this presentation. But as Amanda mentioned, I'll just say this is one of 3 of the studies that search. And so this study I'll share with reflect community-based participatory action research that I conducted over the past year to investigate ways to advance environmental justice for South Asian immigrants across Canada. So just for a little bit of background, environmental health broadly refers to the health impacts, hazardous and or beneficial, resulting from our interactions with the natural world, as well as all of our time spent in various built environments. So this includes our homes, neighborhoods, occupations, institutions, and any other place that we spend time in. And so in Canada, when it comes to environmental health, inequities in particular, emerging research has shown that immigrants in areas of ethnic concentration are exposed to more air pollution in Toronto and Vancouver. And at the same time, lower income recent immigrants, young adults, tenants, visible minorities have. I'm just hoping to point out to you that environmental health, the presence of hazards, but also the lack of access to benefits. And so for my work, building on this, I wanted to specifically South Asian populations, which make up the largest racial health, including race, social, and education. And so the objectives for my study were to capture the impacts of exposure to environmental hazards, as well as access to benefits for South Asians, particularly newcomers living in Toronto, Vancouver, and the surrounding areas. I want to explore their knowledges and understandings of environmental health risk, and I wanted to co-create recommendations for health regulatory policies to better serve these communities and others, more broadly speaking, with implications for racially, ethnically, and gender minoritized people across Canada. And of note, I did design this study to occur and coincide with the development of the federal government a national strategy to address environmental racism and advance environmental justice. So this policymaking process is currently happening right now, and it must be completed by June 2026. I'm not going to go over all the details of what it's expected to include, but I'm happy to talk about them more. But I will say what's really important, and be remiss to not mention this, is that all of us can participate before December on enviroequity.ca in their public consultation. It's currently open to anybody, and it's 4 short surveys. So that's just a plug because I have to. But my study in particular happening while the federal government is developing this strategy is of note because as part of the bill that passed that mandated that the government even develop this strategy, they said that the minister must consult or cooperate with any interested persons, bodies, organizations, or communities. Now, as part of that, I came to kind of know, because I'm somebody who, as Amanda mentioned, works within community organizing spaces, but also knows the literature in this area and have worked in South Asian community public health interventions in my master's and across my research experience. I began to recognize that there was no dedicated effort occurring to bring these communities, who represent a huge population of structurally vulnerable people in Canada, within the EJ policymaking space. And so this presented an opportunity to bring forward a community identified need into this most opportune time. And so the findings from this study are going to be submitted to the federal government as part of these public consultations to inform the development of this strategy. And I've been lucky to be able to converse directly with the department that's working on this, to be able to open up a direct line and make sure that these recommendations are at least seen and engaged with. And this work would not be possible without community partnerships. And so I will go over my methods. And mostly I do that because I think the design of this work and the community engaged nature of this work is really an incredibly important part that contributed to the richness of the findings and really like going about it in a way that was by community for community. And so the groups that I partnered with are Women's Healthy Environments Network, LADLIA, which is a South Asian Women and Girls Advocacy Organization, and then the Fraser Health Authority's South Asian Health Institute, or SAHI for short. And so these partnerships, many years of relationship building since probably the second year of my PhD, I'm in my 5th year now. I've been working to build these relationships out. And as I mentioned, there's no existing group working in this niche. So each of these groups contributes something important, and coming together, we've created our own little coalition of people that can kind of create space for South Asian communities, intersectional perspectives, and environmental justice policy. So over 1+ year of relationship building for each of these groups, and then we developed agreements with MOUs that explicated our roles and the shared benefits that we have from this partnership. And these partners served on a community advisory committee that they were remunerated for. So we met at 2 critical stages. The first was before data collection, where they helped inform my approach and the design of the actual events, including everything from the length, the food, to and even like how. At the end of the day, the decision was ultimately mine to make, but I will say their input really helped guide me in making nuanced decisions that I did feel the day of the event made a difference. And then they also helped in analyzing preliminary findings to help finalize what the community-based recommendations are going to look like, and these will be put forward to the government. Of course, as most community partners do, they amplified recruitment materials, supported on-site location and food, and also helped me hire multilingual South Asian women note takers, which was actually really an important piece that came about into the design of this event as well. So in terms of what I actually set out to do, from May to July of this year, 5 community-based participatory action workshops based in Surrey, Mississauga, and Brampton, with South Asian adults that are living in and around these areas. I want to just take a second that over 200 people actually applied and were eligible to participate in this study. I think 220 applied in total, but 200 were eligible. I think what this says to me, before I even get to any kind of result, is that there's a huge appetite for the South Asian community to engage in this topic. When I first set out to do this work, I did not know what the reception was going to be, because this isn't something that is very routinely discussed in a lot of different circles, like diabetes researches, but not this. So I didn't know if this would be something that if I advertised, people would be interested in, but I think this is just the beginning. I went on to enroll a total of 26 participants, from whom I collected more demographic information, because I really was hoping to set out to do an intersectional study and look and to see what the connections were between all those variables that I told you in the very beginning of the presentation and their impact on potential health outcomes. And so each workshop was 4 hours long, included lunch, travel supports, remuneration, and as I mentioned, a note taker. And both the note taker and myself are multilingual. We all spoke amongst ourselves Hindi, Punjabi, Urdu, which are amongst the most common languages for our participants, although not fully comprehensive. So I did learn some words in like Tamil and Malayalam, but it was really useful to have that level of comfortability with language as well. And the workshops were designed to support knowledge exchange, agency, and empowerment, capture lived experiences and health concerns, and explore participants' conceptualizations of resettlement, belonging, their bodies and health in relation to the environments that they spend time in, and to co-create recommendations, as I mentioned, for wider dissemination. And so I'll go a little bit into the design of the consultations because I think it is important, since this is work that doesn't happen as often as it should, for me to share with you some insights into how I went about designing this with the help of my community partners. So I began each consultation with going over the research objectives, explaining who the partners are, and recapping consent. And we did participant introductions. And then what was really interesting was I was recommended to provide handouts to my participants. And I found this actually to be quite helpful because participants that were shy faced language barriers or maybe just didn't get enough time to get a word in because South Asians can be quite chatty sometimes. This was an opportunity for them to have their space to share opinions with me that I could read and bring into the data analysis, even outside of what is verbally spoken. And given that there were some very, very fresh newcomers as well. Sometimes there was a lack of confidence in knowing the right word to use out loud in a group setting. And so this offered a way for participants to continue to communicate and share their perspectives with me in a safer or alternative manner. I provided a short presentation on environmental health and national environmental justice strategy, kind of what I did for you guys today, but I tried to keep it as lay as possible. The purpose of this presentation was not only to common ground language and to present kind of the scope of what this study is looking at, but it was also to really lean into the knowledge exchange component of this workshop. I didn't want to just extract knowledge from my participants and have them share all their experiences with me. I wanted to give them also in return some terminology, concepts, or even just some kind of understanding of their environmental health inequity, like the concerns that might exist, like what environmental hazards could even look like, for example. And what I found was from all participants actually that many of them wanted the slides to share it further because a lot of participants, they knew these were the issues, but they didn't have the language to say them in the way that we use like commonly in academia or in policy spaces. So to kind of do that cultural brokering with language and concepts. After a short Q&A, we reflected on the daily routines and points of exposure that these individuals face. And this is really leaning into an embodied feminist approach, really leaning into the everyday exposures and walking people through their day-to-day life. And through this, we were able to elicit unique points of exposure for the community members themselves. We discussed structural and procedural barriers, and in particular, accessing information and participating in decision-making. And after a South Asian lunch, which is incredibly important and cannot be overstated for this community, and it's my community, this was such an important part of the whole experience. We went into some of the heavier stuff in identifying resources, tools, communications, and research that might be needed, barriers to reporting, concerns in their neighborhoods. And we take her shared across and really helped me to generate some high level recommendations to really build the confidence with the group that they were already creating recommendations. And I think that was really important because to just start a conversation on recommendations for an average community member sometimes can be kind of daunting. They might not know that they're sharing recommendations, the language that we might see recommendations shared in. And so by doing this, I was just saying back to them what they'd said to us. It really helped them lean in and be like, we've already come up with so many things. We can come up with some more. And so what we then did was really refine and filled in any gaps. And this really led us to co-create recommendations that were quite strong and honestly very comprehensive. So in terms of data analysis, it's pretty standard stuff for qualitative methods. The workshops were recorded and present. So I open coded my transcripts, but I also brought in the note taker. I had done a post event taker memoed that. I took field notes during the session. And as I mentioned, participants, so I triangulated with all of the to help book that I created. As I mentioned, I was reflexively memoing and taking field notes and community validation and expert checking with my partner. I am beginning the process of member checking with participants ahead of writing up my dissertation chapter. So you might be wondering who actually showed up. And this is something that I'm feeling quite happy with, because when I set out to do this, as I said, being kind of the first of its kind, I didn't know what the appetite would be, what the interest would be, if there would be certain groups that are more interested or can find this more accessible than others. But to start off, there was a lot of diversity within the participants present. As a Punjabi, I can say it's quite common for South Asian studies to have an overrepresentation of Punjabis. This was actually not the case. I'm very happy that we had a lot of diversity. We had Punjabi, Gujarati, Rajasthani, North Indian, South Indian, Telugu, Tamil, Sri Lankan, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Nepalese, West Indian. I'm just going to list them all since I started. And the rich that came about because of this ethnic diversity was incredibly important to this study. The participants were between 18 to 58 years old. Most were women. As per the study design, I was hoping to speak to a lot of women and gender diverse people. There were some men and one transgender non-binary person. There was a lot of religious diversity. And thankfully, and this is again a critical part, as I was hoping to speak to people across different immigration statuses, and that was the case. They were people from student visa, work visa, permanent resident, and citizenship backgrounds. Most were first generation immigrants. And then there were also some 1.5 and second generation. So really like a broad range of experiences were what came about in my findings. This is where the people were residing. So as I mentioned, I offered travel support. Some people traveled locally to be able to participate, and it was great to have insight from all of these different areas, all localized to Toronto, Vancouver, and the surrounding areas, where a majority of South Asian people tend to live. Something, again, aligned with what we tend to find in environmental health research. It's really interesting to note that residential instability is often a key factor for how people's health outcomes are. And the majority of this sample were renters or lived in multi-generational homes, which is quite common with South Asian communities. There were diverse sexual orientations. There was representation from individuals who identified as disabled, and 35% of the sample reported they were financially insecure. The levels of education were also quite varied. So as you can see, it's a very diverse sample across the board. And that's why the data, there's a lot of it, because there's a lot of stories that are really bringing in these different insights from all these different experiences. So getting into it, I'm not going to make you read all of this. This is just to give you kind of a visual before I go into the details with some of these. But this is just a high level view of my code book. And I'm just showing you the themes, really, not even like the sub themes or kind of the deeper levels, just in this visual. I had 9 themes that were related to my category of environment. There are intersectional barriers that kind of came about to manufacture additional precarity for these communities in the context of environmental health and just health equity more broadly. And we generated 8 large categories of recommendations. But as I say this to you, there is so much underlying each of these. And today I'll try to get into most of the environmental health hazards and most of the intersectional barriers, and one of the key recommendations that I think really brings in some of the key findings that's emerging from this work. So launching right into it, environmental health hazards wise, the first topic that I want to go over is health impacts of pollution. And so a lot of participants reported exposure to traffic and industrial activity related to outdoor air pollution, concerns about waste management, tap water quality, and pollution in local water bodies. Developed environmental allergies. So if they're in close proximity to construction sites, there's a lot of dust or cement pouring, wildfire smoke, increased pollen. Concerns about living near waste facilities and littering, noise pollution, as I mentioned, prolonged exposure to construction, air quality, as a lot of people in their homes. quite common South Asian families to also enjoy using gas stoves. And so in the Vancouver area, participants identified that near the Knight Street Bridge over Fraser River is particularly concerning. And one of the participants actually said, you know, I live here. And they said, one side is very industrialized. It's where all the auto body parts are, factories, buses, trucks, that's where the shipments are. If you walk 5 to 10 minutes, it's the residential area. I live in an apartment building in the Boundary. And they reflect, I constantly hear trucks going down the road. At 5 a.m. I wake up, I think there's like an earthquake, but no, it's just a big truck. People are always speeding. They want to get on the bridge before rush hour. And there's so many pollutants from the factories. There's even farmland nearby. And in the summer, it smells so bad when they put in manure. So it's a combination of those things. Another really important story that came about is in Mississauga. So I was trying to present, you know, something here and something there, just to give you a slice across the data. And in Milton, IA, who's from Mississauga, reflected, I live in Milton right now. We have a huge waste management facility that for a very long time was far away from the residential areas. But over the last 7-8 years, they've been building new developments, and a lot of South Asian communities are buying these houses because they're cheaper than living in the city. On a hot summer day, if you drive by this, it smells exactly like how you would expect. There was a huge outcry from the community saying, why are we building so many residential houses in this area? All of the newer South Asian immigrants are moving into the area, breathing that air every single day. You see new infrastructure, you see affordable housing, but you're not thinking, why is it so affordable? And then they go on to basically say that they're concerned that the town would approve of certain zoning for residential so close to these toxic environments. And they're really concerned about people with children that are growing up in the area, breathing the air, drinking the water, and being just in that environment, particularly because they note that nearby there's a lot of farmland and they're concerned about pesticides in the water and the soil. Moving to our next theme about food security and access to cultural foods and medicines, again, like that string along with pesticides, there's a big concern about pesticides in the community, food safety and quality, in particular, food safety for imported goods in South Asian grocery stores. There's also food insecurity and lack of affordability for healthy groceries, a reliance on canned frozen food, food banks with Western food, and wanting pesticide-free fresh food, or the ability for some people to grow their own food like they did back home. Conflicts between Western and South Asian approaches to food also kind of are tangled within this, with many mentions of home remedies and Ayurveda. And so just to give you an example, Shanila in Mississauga said, I buy karela. That's bitter melon in English. And it says they're from India, right? So generally I consider it safe. But when I stop and I think, I don't know what's been sprayed on them, right? And this is an example from Lisa, who's food insecure. And Lisa in this is mentioning they have a little one. They are dependent on the food bank, but they have the food that they get from the food bank is not South Asian. They mention that it's like pasta and other things, and they have to change their menu. And so at the supermarket, they also go for discounted options like meat that's going to expire the same day. And then they have to go to the South Asian store, and those things are much more expensive, but we have to buy them because that is their staple. This kind of, again, leads us into talking about products and goods that are being bought. And so consumer product toxins were a concern across all of the workshops, particularly because a lot of people kept saying we have to rely on cheaper products. And that's a big reason why people experience barriers in replacing things like toxic cookware. Indians really care, and I should say South Asian people really care about food, cookware, and food security. These were among the most tagged themes across all of my workshops. Exposure to harmful cleaning products, insecticides, insect repellents, both used inside their home and outside, and exposure to personal care products, toxics in personal care products, as well as through fashion and sports gear, which they noted would be in cheaper quality. And so SK in Vancouver says, when you're here on a temporary status, everyone treats you like you have an expiration date in the country. And you do that as well. I don't invest in material things like in my cookware. During the pandemic, even my parents could barely afford things. I ended up resorting to fast fashion and the things that you can get from which is horrible to support and not healthy. It contains a lot of toxins, but you have sometimes no choice. Will I move in a year or two to another province or country? I realize it's been 7 years, so I haven't really invested in myself here. And related to, again, this idea of not having a choice, one of the more emotional themes that came about in the workshops, again, across all of the 5 events, was this idea that many people healthy. Particularly, every majority of the people in my sample are renters. The rental units are stations, particularly cockroaches. Most rentals are in basements or in high-rise apartments in near traffic, new developments, or industrial areas. There's a lack of windows. Rental appliances are not maintained or are unhealthy. Many people living with mold, asbestos, in congested living spaces, multi-generational homes, or out of affordability, multiple renters. Most report that they lack this healthiness but can't change their conditions. They don't want to report it. They don't know how to liaise. Maybe their landlord, a lot of them said they tried their best, they can't fix it. The frequent agency over temperature control. It became a thing that I would ask in every workshop. Do you guys have an AC? Can you guys afford an AC? Pretty much consistently. And that is like a big concern. Like people are very aware of heat waves. And so SK in Vancouver said, I live in a very old basement and it's not meant for like people to actually live in there. Nisha in Brampton. We used to live in the Malta Avenue of Brampton and there was a problem of the bugs and cockroaches and pesticides in our home. And by pesticides here, I'll just mention what their meaning is the stuff used to kill the bugs within their own home. We had to like force the landlord and we had to repeatedly say to them, please, we are suffering. It took 4 months for him to take a step. And one of the most powerful stories that came about for me personally was that of KS in Toronto. They said, we live in a cockroach infested building. So there's cockroaches and different bugs everywhere. It's off the walls, the cabinets, within the fridges. You can't really do anything about it. It's just too expensive to move. I was 10 years old when we moved here and it's been just over a decade. It's only gotten worse. A lot of the products that we use to get rid of the bugs are contaminated within our food, clothing, and personal care products. And it's impacted our health quite a bit. I ended up in the hospital because of an autoimmune response. I am pretty confident that if we did live in an area where those issues did not exist and we had more money, then we wouldn't be having as many of the health issues we are having now. There's periods of times where I cannot mentally deal with it. I just want to leave so badly. But at the end of the day, you have to just learn to live with it, learn to deal. There's a certain level of resiliency. This should still not really be the standard, but we have no other recourse. Another area that was quite emotional in the workshops was workplace discussions. And so many people reported it was commonplace to have workplace injuries, a lack of oversight and safety, and experience discrimination in their workplace. Newcomers often reported undertaking survival jobs. And so this is actually a unique type of job that's open to newcomers where they're being taken advantage of and also lack safety. And there's also a lack of information and training about worker safety in general. So not having PPE or not even knowing what chemicals you're working with in your workplace. And so PK shares, I'm Bangladeshi, and a lot of my uncles are taxi drivers and delivery drivers, and they're always surrounded by exhaust and fumes. I think it's a really big hazard in our communities. These are our loved ones. These are our elders. And these are the kinds of occupations they haven't necessarily chosen because they like, because they came here as immigrants, what was open to them. And so building on this, I wanted to just dive a little bit deeper into this concept of survival jobs because it was brought up and it was very interesting and very, again, intersectionally connected to a lot of what I was hearing about lack of choice in jobs. And so HK in Brampton reflected that survival jobs are a type of job where employees are in closed spaces for more than 10 to 12 hours with limited breaks. And Nisha in Brampton, who is a full-time student, but also works for frame assembly warehouse mentioned, I agree. I think international students tend to do any job they see and get. There is like doing jobs in very, very low wages and cash. It's not worth it, but they have to survive and to pay for college fees and for food and groceries. An IA in Mississauga, who used to work in a 1 million square foot warehouse, also said 95% of the people that were working in their warehouse had no air conditioning during work hours. And 80 to 90% of them were South Asian. A lot of newcomer immigrants, a lot of students trying to figure out what they want to do with their life, working in an extremely unhealthy environment, considering people are spending 40 to 60 hours a week there. And so this is, again, of course, going to have a very taxing impact on mental health. And I want to dive a little bit into psychosocial hazards here. So not only are these things happening and people are experiencing these things, but even in other spaces, South Asians in my groups were reporting a lack of safety and lack of access and belonging in public parks and on transit. despite being heavily reliant on transit for all of their mobility needs, as well as a lack of ability to adapt to climate change. As I mentioned, for example, none of them can afford ACs, that people that I interviewed. And so SK shares an example here. I had a very negative experience on the bus where a man who looked like he was under the influence of substances followed me off. When I got off my stop, he was following me home. It was very scary. Just knowing how much Asian hate or Indian hate there is, it's always scary. You never know what's going to happen. As a brown woman, you just feel defenseless. I couldn't really protect myself. I did call the cops, but nothing happened. I'm on the bus for 3 hours every day. And I have a lot of instances where people have conversations saying they're so sick of seeing Indians around. They're everywhere. And they're sitting right next to me. It's not good for my mental health. And so, in a summary, these are some of the key environmental hazards that I've gone over today. But I think what's most concerning is that none of these are happening in isolation. People are experiencing a cumulative exposure, and that is of the greatest concern because it wasn't like one person said, I only experienced this one thing. Most people were saying yes, and many people experienced many of these things all at once. To quote my committee member, Renisa, actually, she put it quite well. She said it's like a constant bombardment of exposure that people have to mitigate and navigate every day. And so the full picture, however, is a little bit more nuanced. And I want to dive a little bit into the intersectional barriers that I identified. So I will only go over a few of them today, and I'll end off on one recommendation. But as I said, I'm happy to talk more about some of these. And so exposure to environmental hazards in this context, I found, was also impacted by discrimination, racism, xenophobia, colonization, gender-based inequities, differences in how South Asians conceptualize environmental risk, which is important if you think about it. In Canada, it's Anglo-centric, and there are Western constructs that dominate kind of our policymaking spaces, our research spaces, and even just our public communication and public narratives. The confluence of race, immigration, income, housing, and job security, these things coming together to create and manufacture a really unique set of circumstances of precarity that without any one of them would maybe not look the exact same, but with all of them create really dire structural vulnerability. And then factors influencing access to healthcare. So really, again, seeing race, gender, and immigration status play key roles in how people navigate the healthcare system to even improve their health outcomes in the face of some of these exposures. So I'm going to go over the impacts of discrimination and racism. And I'll say these are just some of the sub-themes that came about in my findings. So a lot of the group's members shared stories, and a common sentiment that came about was that all South Asians have experienced discrimination, but it could sometimes look almost invisible or minor. It could be like a bullying when you're a kid, or othering, or microaggressions, or it could even be overt. But experiencing some form of difference has really been a common experience amongst everybody in my sample. And this contributes to negative psychological impacts, often compounded with intergenerational trauma, because for some people, their parents and grandparents experience even more discrimination if they were the first ones immigrating. So there's this intergenerational trauma piece. A lot of blame towards South Asians for the climate crisis, a common argument being because of overpopulation, or pollution, working in harmful industries, not knowing how to recycle, or other societal issues. So again, like recession, inflation, this association with stealing jobs. Increased online hate, even within and from the South Asian community towards newcomers, a lack of recognition of the contribution of immigrants, and then also these connotations of certain areas that are very South Asian predominant, like Brampton and Surrey, as being gang-filled, violent, backwards, or unsafe. And this is a direct wording from participants within the workshops as well. And then that extension spreading to the wider South Asian community and how people see the South Asian community. And so Summer puts it as, the climate crisis disproportionately affects minorities, including South Asians, because we live in less developed neighborhoods where there's less access to health services, you're earning less, there's less resources to be prepared if the climate crisis happens. At the same time, the large amount of scapegoating and blame on immigrants, especially South Asians, is just common discourse at this point. There's too many of them here. And it puts even more mental burden and stress on us when we have less resources to be able to deal with issues if something does arise. Racialized immigrants also, as I mentioned, that unique kind of component where bringing together housing, income, and job insecurity and the interconnection. So a lot of the time, people might wonder, well, what if this is all related to income? Why can't they just get a better job? Or what is the kind of, like I mentioned, confluence of these factors? And so oftentimes it feels like they have no choice but to do low income work. And at the same time, South Asians under the collectivist model, the community, often also take on financial obligations for their families. And again, that piece of precarity, wanting to be unproblematic due to fear of discrimination or immigration status, comes together because SK explains, for example, a 3-year bachelor's degree from India does not qualify when you're immigrated. But if you get one from Britain, it's acceptable. And so having to redo degree certifications, for example, or even seeing everywhere needs Canadian experience. SK is actually finishing a diploma in HR, and they said it's a best practice to not do that. And unless you're funding like Canada Summer Jobs actually requires for that to be part of the condition, it feels discriminatory otherwise. And Tara agreed, adding, if the qualified Canadian doesn't want the job, but there's an immigrant who wants the job, even then you cannot because of your immigration status. So there are like entrenched factors within the immigration process and status and all of these pieces that come together to create even the opportunity that immigrants could have for better financial success. And one of the last ones that I'll go over before I end off on my recommendation is regarding gender-based inequities. And so South Asian women are responsible for household shopping, cooking, cleaning, and oftentimes that burden of precautionary consumption, of researching what's coming into their household and the impact that it could have on the health of the household. At the same time, it's so exhausting to navigate healthcare systems and to research all these healthy products. And at the same time, again, there's that component of cumulative risk for women. One participant in particular mentioned they developed PCOS, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is known to be linked to endocrine disruptors. And so there's a lot to navigate as a woman. And Shanila in Mississauga mentions, we as women who buy everything, we have a big influence. If we are informed, we'll be able to help the whole community. Gender roles, believe me, in our community, they are still very much what they were at the time of my grandmother. You have to obey the man, and your job is cooking, cleaning, looking after the kids. In Canada, an additional burden is also earning. So you have it made, right? Most of the time, you are so worked up, you don't have time. I feel this is also kind of a big injustice. And so on that, AP also mentioned in Mississauga that there's products that are marketed specifically towards women, and for example, Fair and Lovely, which is the skin whitening cream. They also mentioned that, I don't even think twice when I pick up some of these products at the South Asian grocery store because it's instinctual and habitual for us. And, my mom or my grandparents would say, well, this is what we used back home. And this is actually my last theme for today before my recommendation. It's this idea that there are differences in how South Asians and Westerns are conceptualizing environmental health. And there's also sometimes challenges, particularly for newcomers, in learning different approaches. And so an example, again, from Shanila, building on that, they mentioned, in my community, it's the habits, rituals, practices, and the lack of information. She, for example, wants to eat healthy organic food, but she says, in my household, it's not my decision. It's my kids, my husband, it's people who come over. I have to cater to them. At the same time, she says, we cannot afford organic food. In our community, we don't believe in it. Everybody makes fun of it. At parties, they say, oh, this is a scam. This is bogus. It's just a way of getting more money. And then many ladies don't have a good command of English. They don't even understand the word environment. They need to be spoken to in different languages to understand. Otherwise, if you talk environment at a South Asian gathering, people will make fun of you. And so to kind of bridge that together, SP said, I agree, some words don't translate. And they said, what even is sustainability in Hindi? You have to use a lot more words to explain the concept. And RJ says, I'm sensing there's a difference in the way we understand the environment and our conception of the environment in our community. Back in our homelands, it's a part of everything we do. It's an extension of our community as well. It's not a separate issue. And so I want to end off the presentation by talking about recommendations. And while I don't have time to go through all of these, I did want to focus in on just the one that I think bridges together some of the most important insights that are coming about from this work. And that is the critical need for intersectional and interdepartmental solutions to address cumulative health impacts and climate adaptation. So just to, again, keep grounding it within the work that my participants are sharing their perspectives, PK says, I don't think it should just be the environmental department. It needs to involve public health, agriculture, fisheries, indigenous services. It needs to be interdisciplinary and cooperative because environmental health impacts every single thing in our entire way of life. And so what I'm going to end off on is just kind of reminding you all that Canada's system right now is built for single issue risk, but advancing environmental justice requires we better address cumulative risks. Just to demonstrate, and I'm not going to go through all of this here, but just to demonstrate for each of the bolded issues that have come about in this presentation, there are whole different acts, ministries, departments, jurisdictions across municipal, provincial, territorial, federal, even across the federal government, different acts regulating these aspects. But to a person, this is their whole lifespan. This is like one cumulative exposure. And so I think the biggest recommendation, as I said on the last slide, is we need to begin to be better at addressing these cumulative risks. And not only will we help communities like South Asians, we will actually help pretty much everybody, because this is something that I think we can all relate to. We as humans have the body burdens across all of these different points of exposure. Thank you so much for your time.